Okay, so welcome everyone who is just joining us now. I'm Morgana Raventree, the National First Officer of Covenant of the Goddess, and this is our Leadership Institute, which we hold every year as part of our Grand Council observance, which was last week. And this year, Cherry Hill Seminary is presenting a series of panels for us. I don't know what else to say about it. I didn't say this morning. So
That's
in any case, I would like to thank Holly very much for facilitating this event today. And I hope you will stay with us for the rest of the day.
Great. It's good to see so many people, a lot of new faces as well as old. We're going to go ahead and go into the next panel. It'll take me just a minute to put our panelists on spotlight. Margo, are you with us?
Yeah, I'm right here.
Do you want to do the intros of our panelists while I get them on spotlight?
Pull this up again. I'm just looking at the I don't have the bios in my document. I apologize.
Okay, that's all right. I've got them and
I'm checking my email.
ready here in just a minute. Zoom keeps reshuffling everybody at the top when I select one of you.
I just pulled it up. Here we go.
Okay, great.
All right. Make sure I get this right. There we go. Okay, Wes Isley, MDiv, retired hospital chaplain. Bryce, Bryce, can you pronounce your name for me correctly?
Of course. My last name is Woyak.
Woyak. Thank you. He's working hospital chaplain, and as we just announced that he is now board certified. Congratulations.
Actually, hospice.
Hospice, excuse me. Keith Cates, PhD, clinical counselor, specializing in work with military, EMS, fire, law enforcement, educational, and medical personnel. And Ben Luma, MDiv, working hospital chaplain. Thank you so much to our panelists for joining us.
Thank you. Again, we appreciate you being here. I thought we would start by clarifying what's the difference between religious care and spiritual care. So what's the distinction between chaplaincy, pastoral counseling, and spiritual direction? And some of you have cross training in some of these disciplines, some of you don't. So all of you do not have to respond, but I think it would be helpful for our guests to all hear a little bit about that. Bryce, do you want to tackle it first?
Sure, happy to jump in there. So I'll tackle the first part about that, the difference between religious care and spiritual care. At the outset of this answer, I will say that these boundaries are blurry, as we could probably expect. And so different folks on this panel, different folks that you meet out in the field will have different definitions and understandings. For me personally, when I think of religious care, I put that as care that's provided based in specific religious services. So often these are specific religious worship services. These are specific religious sacraments. These are things that you would normally go to a minister for, somebody within a faith community, a priest, a priestess for. Spiritual care, on the other hand, I think of as much broader. Religious care can sometimes be encompassed by spiritual care, but spiritual care is really attending to how folks interact with the meaning-making institutions, themes, and systems of their own life. So specifically as the spiritual care provider myself, I'm often talking about how do these meaning-making systems make sense, don't make sense, provide comfort, or provide distress at any given moment. And we're holding all of that together. For myself, in my chaplaincy context, I've been in acute care and now I work in hospice care, and I do draw a pretty distinct boundary for myself between religious care and spiritual care. I'm there to attend to the spirit, but not to be your minister. And there are a number of reasons for that. But one is really that I want to make sure I provide equitable care to all of my patients, and I'm not discriminating on what types of care I can provide based upon my patient's religious affiliation. So those are kind of where I hold spiritual care and religious care. In terms of the differences between chaplaincy, spiritual direction, pastoral counseling, I am a certified chaplain as well as a spiritual director. So I do both of those. And I really feel that spiritual direction and chaplaincy are on the same spiritual care continuum, whereas chaplaincy tends to be more acute care and hospice setting, like you would have an acute care therapist if you were in an acute care or inpatient setting for mental health reasons. So do you have a chaplain in those acute care settings to attend to those immediate spiritual care needs? Whereas spiritual direction, I really find myself as more of an outpatient provider, like you would have on discharge planning from a hospital for mental health needs, and you go see the therapist out in the community. So I definitely think they're not one and the same, but very contiguous disciplines. As for pastoral counseling, I personally don't have experience in that, so I will leave that to someone else to delve into and hopefully educate me.
Okay, thank you, Bryce. Would somebody else like to comment on this question? Yes, Keith.
Yes, but I have to qualify. I'm a bit of the odd duck out. I mean, while I have chaplaincy training and experience, I am primarily a clinical therapist. And so the way that I see it and the way I work in it, considering I spend my days swimming through other people's subconsciouses, is almost, and perhaps not even almost, as an identity and then as a community. So spiritual, I cannot say anything better than Bryce has already said. And congratulations, Bryce. You earned everything. You deserve everything you've earned on that one. But Bryce said it beautifully. And the concept of does it relate to a particular set of doctrines or practices or identities is very valid. But at the same time, we incorporate them, we internalize them as identity. Spiritual identity is an identity. Religious practice can be an identity. And they also have a tendency to bump up against each other as we move through our daily practices, our beliefs, our behaviors in the world. And so from my particular view of it, they are all a continuum. I mean, it's a very ugly continuum in a way, and it's very murky and sticky, but they all do move from one to the next.
Mm-hmm.
And they are a deep core, almost a drilled core of your personality and your perspective. And so in those kind of cases, I can't see them really individually. And then my practices as a therapist also do incorporate to the extent that I can legally when I need to then get them over to somebody else that's better qualified than I am, particularly in that area, particularly from that religious or spiritual point of view. So I don't find the value to separating them off as much as I used to. But in my particular corner of the world, that's the way I'm using them.
Okay, thank you. Wes?
Holly, I'll add a little something about pastoral counseling specifically. I'm not one, but I did receive pastoral counseling a number of years ago when I was practicing Christian. And historically, it's been within a Christian context. The distinctions are that, the counselors would receive more formal education, and have some licensure depending on which state they work in. But it's always within a religious context. It might not be in a church, but the topics that you'll discuss would be more spiritual, specifically religious in nature, is what I've experienced it. And so, you may think of to kind of talk a little more about the differences between chaplaincy, spiritual direction, and so on. Pastoral counselor might be in a church setting, or they might have an office that you would go to like any other licensed therapist or counselor. Whereas a chaplain is going to be found typically in a hospital, a prison, maybe certainly a hospice, and some other kind of institutional setting. And then spiritual direction, again, could be most anywhere. You might have an office, they might come to your home. It all depends on how they want to work. So those are a few other points there.
Great, thank you. And I saw your face look funny when we said retired. Did I get that wrong? Okay, that's what I thought. Lucky
No,
guy.
that's true. No, sorry, I did
He's
not.
a trust fund baby. He's too young to be retired. Just kidding. Ben, do you have some comments you'd like to share?
I think what everybody already said is pretty good. One thing I would say is that as professional chaplains, I think we do sometimes more religious care than we might at first want to, and it can be done across faith traditions and is done across faith traditions. So, for example, if you have you're taking care of somebody who's Muslim who asks you to bring a prayer rug, that is religious care. You are seeing to their religious needs, and certainly, you know, a lot of the research that's been done in chaplaincy, when people ask patients or clients what they expect from the chaplain versus what the chaplains themselves say what they expect or want to be doing, the top of what they want us to be doing is almost always prayer. And so that ability to pray in multiple religious languages is a form of religious care, and I think is one of the essential skills of chaplaincy.
Thank you. I think for a lot of our guests who don't have this training, I wanted to clarify, why is it that the title of this is "What does it mean to be a chaplain and a pagan?" not "What does it mean to be a pagan chaplain?" Would one of you like to take that one? Ben, I see you nodding.
Well, again, I think that gets to that same, possibly that same distinction. Most of, I can't really think of anybody that I personally know that's an exception besides a few people in volunteer positions. Most people who are pagans and who are employed as chaplains are employed as interfaith chaplains. And so our job, first and foremost, is to care, as Bryce put it, to everybody that we encounter and that we work with equitably, no matter what their faith background is, or if they have no faith background. And so most of us are probably not in the habit of walking into a room and saying, "Hey, I'm the pagan chaplain." We just say, "Hey, I'm the chaplain." And then paganism might be something that we personally carry as our religious identity or as part of our religious identity. But that may or may not actually come up when we're caring for people.
Has it come up for either of you, Bryce or Wes? Bryce?
It has. I guess it kind of depends on what you mean by come up. I'll say thank you very much, Ben. I think that's a really wonderful summary of it, and I greatly agree. Even in my personal life, I've had colleagues of mine, other professional chaplains, who have said, "Oh, you're a pagan chaplain." They say, "No, no, I'm no more a pagan chaplain than we have a Muslim oncologist. I am a chaplain who has a pagan worldview, and that certainly informs who I am. That certainly informs my life. It informs my spiritual care, just like being a gay man does. But you probably wouldn't call me the gay chaplain." Um, and where it does come up, it's come up in my training program. And I know we may be getting to that a little bit later, but just kind of wrapping your head around, how do you have a very different identity from a lot of those that you serve? And how does that come up authentically and congruously to provide care? And then with my patients, though, I will sometimes get asked, "What's your faith background?" or "What church do you belong to?" And I keep it very true to who I am as a chaplain professional and say, I don't belong to a church. I work within this organization. I provide spiritual care. I am here for everybody. And I do have a background in many religions. I was raised Roman Catholic. I studied Buddhism and Judaism, Hinduism, modern neo-paganism, and just leave it very open.
Thank you.
If I may put a finer point on that.
Yeah.
and I'm coming at this from a slightly different point of view. In a very recent past life, I was the executive director of the licensing board in Alabama for counselors. And I want to clarify on the point and continue what Bryce was saying. No, it is not different. You are a chaplain, you are a provider, you are a supporter, you're a services. However, it is extremely important that those that are doing those chaplaincies and those duties are well trained in it and do know the difference between them, because on a very legal, ethical level, we've had many problems with people who were semi-trained or thought they had it, when in reality, the law is much more specific. So for those that are well-trained, as Cherry Hills graduates are, that's why I'm so happy to work with them. They understand the difference of when theirs stops and the other one should begin, and where do the next services pick up. And this is what I'm providing. Here's what I can move you on to the next part, and know where the lines are and know where they're highly competent and where they need to pass it off. And that's where we're at in the country at the moment, is our programs are moving that way, but by far not all of them are that way. And it is becoming a legal, ethical, moral issue when they cannot provide the services that they might be providing.
Mhm. Great, thank you.
Yes,
Wes?
and Holly, I'll add too. So there might be some contexts where, for example, if you're volunteering and you're pagan and you're called a chaplain. For example, right now I'm congregational chaplain for Sacred Well Congregation. And so in that capacity, I'm only ministering to pagans. But those are kind of, very specific to groups. You might go in if you're volunteering in a prison or a jail, and you might offer meetings for other pagans, then you would maybe be called a pagan chaplain. But those are kind of very specific circumstances. And like the other folks have said, if you're in a hospital and you're employed there, then you're really offering care for anyone. And your religious background is certainly part of you, but it's not the reason you're there.
In my experience with prisons, we get brought in to supplement the existing chaplains because they feel lost. I see a hand, Bryce.
I just wanted to add on what you were saying, Wes, because you bring up a really important point, right? For myself, I approach this from clinical chaplaincy because I work in the healthcare system, but we also have to recognize, and it's important to know, that chaplaincy is different across industries. So places like Department of Corrections and also military, well, broad spectrum spiritual care is still part of the chaplain's discipline. It is much more religious focused ministry, so that you are the Catholic chaplain, you are the Lutheran chaplain. And hospital settings used to be that way as well, but it has changed as the demographic of folks that we serve have changed.
That's good to hear. Okay, how do you provide spiritual care to somebody of a different religion than yourself? I'll continue that same question. How do you prepare to meet the other in others and in yourself, including believers and non-believers, atheists, everybody?
So if I can just jump in,
Go ahead,
sorry,
Ben.
Wes, you raised your hand. I mean, I think the first thing there is I take it as a basic premise that everybody is the kind of the final authority on their own religious and spiritual life. And so in some very meaningful ways, you're not usually even if you are a chaplain representing the dominant who represents the dominant culture, you can't walk in and assume that somebody else that has the same religious background is going to have the same beliefs or practices or worldview. And so spiritual care, I think, always, again, speaking for me, always starts from a place of curiosity about the other person, about how who they are and how they connect with meaning and purpose in their own lives, and then how can they be supported in that. So, and you can do that with people that are of your religion, and you can do that with people that are not of your religion. And I guess that concept of meeting the other you know, we're always encountering the other, even if we think that we're in a closed system where, you know, everybody here is part of the same tradition or part of the same religious background, because no two people have the same exact same views on everything.
Thank you. Any other comments? Wes, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll say that one thing that I always did when I was working in the hospital setting, in a diverse setting like that, you had to learn how to sort of read between the lines. So someone may go, I mean, if I go into a room and someone wants prayer, they may want scripture reading, something like that. That's just the surface, is how I see it. So what they're really looking for is comfort. They're looking for reassurance. They're looking for, hope as they understand it, those kinds of things. And so while I might be of a different religious practice, spiritual practice, I know what it means to offer comfort. And so I have to then say, well, what does comfort mean for you? And it's my job as a chaplain is to facilitate that. Folks in a hospital setting are very vulnerable. They don't have a lot of resources at their disposal. And, for better or for worse, the chaplains kind of control that in a sense, but we have the ability to facilitate that. The nurses and doctors certainly don't have the time. Social workers don't have the time, and so on. So that's our job, is to facilitate that and help them hopefully find that support, find that comfort, whatever it might be, while they're in that setting. And it can be a challenge to do that for someone who's not the same spiritual practice as you are, but it's also a wonderful reward when you learn how to, and it's not so much something that I do or that we as chaplains do. It's I think Ben said about being curious. So if you're curious and you learn the kinds of questions to ask people, they really guide you and they tell you what they need. And as long as you're listening and you hope you have some kind of resource at your disposal or training or whatever, then it makes it more easy to deliver that kind of care.
I'll go from that curiosity bend a little bit, because I think what's really important as a chaplain is to always have in mind that you are encountering the other. It's not you. And so to be curious. And I have found in my own spiritual care formation and provision still to this day, the patients, the clients where I have the most misses are the ones that I'm closest to theologically, worldview wise, because there are biases and assumptions that I just have about how their world works that I don't even recognize that I'm putting onto them without being curious. So in many ways, I have felt that coming into chaplaincy as somebody from a non-dominant religion and having that background, and as somebody from a non-dominant sexuality, having that background has been really helpful because it's helped me remain more humble, more curious about people who are generally different than I am.
And that's a good answer to one of the questions we had on here. Are there any advantages pagans might have when working as a chaplain? Thanks, Bryce. Keith, did you want to comment on how you prepare to be there for the other?
Well, I was going to take what Wes said and kind of flip it around and, give due credit to Maslow. I found that a cup of coffee transcends almost every religious domain. And the same goes for every clinical operation. The vast majority of now, when I am working in my clerical duties with the OTO, then I am coming at it from a thelemic point of view because they have certain priority values. It's just like every community has its priority values, but on a larger scale, when a client walks in, I don't know necessarily what they are. I don't ask the religious question on my intake paperwork, nor should I. It will come out if it needs to come out. But at the same point, to simply be present and to sit there with them or to sit there with them with the issue. Had a good cup of coffee or a good cup of tea, and the presence is enough if you're present, that these salient needs will rise to the top. And maybe there's homosexuality will come out, or maybe their Christianity will come out, and maybe it won't, and maybe it's not important. But the being there is fundamentally important to every connection I have with any client that then is looking for more of a spiritual or a religious or a directional guidance point of view, so that we can then get to, because I'm of the opinion, as I said, the subconscious is my office, and that's where we're coming from. We're coming from comfort, we're coming from connection, we're coming from need. And it kind of doesn't matter which direction we come from, we're all heading in that direction. So we move them forward. As Wes said, I'm not here to tell you what. You're here to help me figure out with you what. And so how do you connect to them? Well, part of it is just be human, be an open human, be as I said, be a person-centered, and then be there present for them, and not at them, but with them.
Mm-hmm. Good. Wes, you and I have done a fair bit of disaster spiritual care. And I'm hearing that each of us, each setting we're in is a little bit different. And I've had people run up to me and want me to pray with them right there. And they just had a second and then they had to run on. And I knew they were evangelical Christians. And because it's been almost 40 years since I left that behind, I don't know, I just fell into praying with them in sort of a gentle way, but I did finish up in Jesus' name. I prayed in a way they would understand, and they were happy. That's all they wanted. But I know that a lot of pagans would just blanch to hear me say that, which I just did on a recording. Yes, it will go public later. So I wonder if you have any comments about, have you encountered some situations like that, and what did you do?
Yeah. Oh gosh. I mean, a
Because you
ton of
were at a
situations.
hospital in my little hometown. I've often
Yes.
thought about that.
So, well, I often joked with my supervisor when I was at the hospital that every with a patient was an interfaith encounter, but it was true because everybody was a different religion than me, but the majority of them were Christians. But because I'm pagan, I mean, they didn't know all this. But so I don't think I ever saw that I know of a pagan patient in that particular hospital, mostly because of where it was located. But I understand what you're saying about having sort of a resistance to praying in a certain way or using in Jesus' name and those kinds of things. And I think, and what we had to do, and I wasn't the only non-Christian at the time at the hospital. And so we would talk about, well, how do we handle this? What feels right to us? I didn't want to, for myself, having been a Christian and overall having a good experience, there was something about I didn't want to sort of misrepresent myself, but I also didn't want to have this whole thing become about me being pagan. So I thought of phrases that I could use to end a prayer that were generic enough that the patient or the person who I was caring for would accept it. And it was also something that I could say that did not violate my understanding of the divine or something like that. So I think that's a very personal kind of thing to do. And so it just you kind of have to work through that. There's no real magic or secret to it. It's something that I think is individual for each chaplain, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Bryce?
Yeah, I'll add a little bit to that as well. I think there's this idea, even among many chaplains, that if you go into a room and I'm a Catholic priest and here's a Catholic layperson before me, that we're both praying to the same Jesus, right? But who that person is across from you may have a very different connection and very different concept of what divinity, deity, theology looks like to them. So we really are always in that interfaith and really that creative, interspiritually creative space. For myself, this is something I had to wrestle with in my CPE. So in my training, clinical pastoral education, was how do you authentically be with people when you are praying with them to a deity who is not your own, which I also feel is a bit of an unfair bias because I got asked that a lot by my educator, but really the same question needed to be asked to everyone in that cohort, whether they were Christian, Muslim, Jewish, pagan, whatever, because we're always encountering the other there. And this is one of the places where I feel that my pagan background actually gives me a bit of a superpower, in that I am a polytheist, and that, yes, Yahweh and Jesus and I have agreed to see other people for the benefit of all of us. But when I come together with a patient and that is their God, I'm here to provide what I can provide and then to triage my care to the next level of care provision. And that is their deity. And so I can come there and be very authentic in that, yes, you know, Yahweh is not my God, but he is yours, and I give you to him.
Mhm. Thank you. By the way, I didn't make a practice of doing that. It just kind of slipped out when I was with her. Old habits.
I'll just
Ben,
add that
you.
I feel like I've become more comfortable as I've been a chaplain using explicitly religious language uh, for religions that are not my own. I think when I first started out, I had a lot of internal stuff about it, like, should I do this? Should I not do it? Am I misrepresenting myself if I say in Jesus's name? And at some point, I just sort of got over it. I work in a very Catholic part of the world, so I was never Catholic, but I say a lot of Hail Marys and Our Fathers these days because that's what that's what prayer looks like to a lot of the people that I'm working with, and that's just the way it is.
That's a good phrase that I'm going to try and keep. That's what prayer looks like for a lot of people. Keith, did I see a hand over there? And if
No, ma'am, but I would like to make a comment on it I
Yes.
don't think it's disingenuous to say that everyone I meet is the other and everywhere they come from is the other. I would be foolish to think it's a copy paste world. I know we desperately try to make things binary that way, but that's not the way the truth is. And so to not distance them, but to expect not to understand them at the beginning and to come at it from hopefully a non-biased view, which of course is difficult since we all carry them, is a very powerful place to come from, because hopefully then we can come from a place, I hope we can come from a place of commonality and not difference. But at the same point, this has been my world for decades, and I have a big shelf on my office with all the holy books on it that I can find, and I read them and I study them, and I hope I understand some of them. And I hope when you start speaking to me from wherever you come from, I'll recognize some of it and can go there with you. But I'm not going to pretend to be, the authority, but we have to connect.
Mhm. Thanks. Keith, would you start? I'm sorry, Wes, you have something?
Yeah, just real quick, kind of going off what Keith said about familiarity and having things in common. I think Holli's talking about how you let the in Jesus name slip. Well, I think it would be safe to say that, in the in the South, in smaller towns, I mean, that's almost just sort of a thing you say anyway. And so I know in Gastonia, when I worked there were times, because of my own background and my own experiences as a Christian, even though now I'm now pagan, I could identify with a lot of people. And there weren't, I guess they were relatively few, but in some cases, I really felt a spiritual connection with that person in spite of our theological differences. And so my knowledge of Christian scripture would come forward, or other ways that I may have used to pray many years ago. And so that would just come out. And it was genuine. I wasn't trying to perform or anything like that. And it surprised me, but it was because I felt that connection with them. And because of that, I felt comfortable praying in that way or sharing in that way. And I think, when you can do that, it's maybe not your goal per se, but it can be really special when that does happen.
Yeah, it's a good way to put it. I wanted to ask all of you, and I was starting with Keith since he does education, but any of you that wants to jump in, could you share what kind of educational or training needs somebody who wants to do chaplaincy work should receive or seek out?
Well, come from higher education, I'm going to immediately jump to please find a reputable program, because there are so many programs out there that are not reputable, but they're small, church-based, very local, and perhaps even very myopic on their view of it. And of course, then perhaps I shouldn't say of course, but then they have a tendency to only view things within a certain.
Well, we just lost you. Within a certain.
Sorry, I don't know where you lost me, but I do believe in my experience is that many of them from those small programs, if a program can be what it's called, have guidelines that then limit them, and that is not what chaplaincy is. That is not the broader base of it. So I'm going to go immediately to one, find a good program that has a reasonable reputation, and two, make sure it does include, and this is my bias, the counseling parts of it, where you then do know where your skills should end and the next professional skills should begin. You can be both, but it's not always the best answer.
Yeah, good, thank you. Bryce, would you like to comment?
Sure. I'll go off of what Keith said as well. Make sure you find a reputable program. That's very important for making sure that you have the background that's necessary to really engage with folks in a curiosity way. I want to say non-biased, but I think actually what a good program does is teach us how to use and recognize our biases and convert them into curiosity, because that's part of being human and we won't get away from that. In terms of education, this is kind of depends on what you want to do with your chaplaincy, right? So I would definitely, if you're thinking about going into this or have somebody that you know who would be interested in some form of professional chaplaincy, take a look. Is this healthcare chaplaincy? Is this working for a hospice or a hospital? Those have different requirements often. Is this working for the Department of Corrections? Is it military? Each of those is slightly different. A general basis is to have a master's degree in some sort of helping profession. Often that's a Master of Divinity degree. That's been kind of the traditional way, but that's by no means the only educational master's degree that chaplaincy positions will look for. And then there is clinical pastoral education, which is, you can kind of think of it like doctors go and do a residency, a medical residency, to learn their craft in the clinic. And chaplains will do that as well. And regardless of which area of chaplaincy you go into, those CPE experiences are very important because they teach you how to use that natural curiosity and how to be information with yourself in a self-reflective model. So typically, if you're going for like a clinical chaplain and going towards something like board certification, you'll need some higher education master's degree, and then anywhere from 2 to 4 units of clinical pastoral education, depending on who your certifying body will be. And there may be other requirements as well. I know in the chat they've been talking about faith endorsement. So one of the very large organizations out there that certifies chaplains does require endorsement from a faith group, but others do not. So for example, I'm endorsed through the Spiritual Care Association, and they do not require faith group endorsement because their research found that it doesn't make any difference to the care that you provide.
Okay. Wes?
I'll add to, if you were wanting to do chaplaincy type work, but more in a volunteer setting, like American Cancer Society, American Red Cross. I got my societies mixed up. But with the American Red Cross, they provide a lot of their own training, which is really pretty good. And so if you want to go into a situation like a hurricane shelter, which I've done, or a situation where there's a shelter set up for flood victims, it could be a mass shooting incident, for example. The Red Cross gives really good training, and they have some other requirements. I don't know if they've been updated now since I did that, but that's something you need to check with the organization, obviously. And then too, if you're going into a prison or a jail, you may not need a Master of Divinity as a volunteer, but I think it would be good to look around and see what kind of organizations might give some good training. It's always good to have basics in counseling, basics in group dynamics, because all of these things are, going to come up perhaps unexpectedly in your groups or with administration or staff and so on. And so having as much training as you can get is going to help you serve the people you're there to serve better, and hopefully help you avoid some of the pitfalls that you might fall into as a chaplain, even as a volunteer.
Thank you.
If I may, somebody asked a question. I wanted to clarify something I said. The question was, what are 2 or 3 examples of reputable programs? Perhaps I used the word reputable incorrectly, but it's exactly what Wes was saying. Is a good program, in my biased opinion, and it is a biased opinion, is going to be a program that looks further out than its own religious, spiritual, doctrinal point of view, pushes that student to have a broader view, and then incorporate some of the counseling side of it, which is a bit of ethics, a bit of law, a bit of psychopathology, skills, group, theory, perhaps. And I say this the way I say it because we have 2 divinity programs here very close to me that are extremely exclusive and are quite focused on what they offer and what they provide, and they are quite convinced that they are right and everyone else is wrong. And their chaplaincy clinical services are extremely, now this depends on where you stand. I'm going to call them biased. They're going to call them focused. I find that to be an unacceptable approach to chaplaincy services because, to me, it violates the spirit of what chaplaincy is. They disagree. We have discussed this. We are not coming to terms, I suspect. But the point being that I want it to be broad enough that when a person comes out of these programs, whether it be a divinity or any other training system, that they have the breadth to be able to connect wherever they need to, not just where they choose to.
Yeah. Bryce.
Perhaps a shameless promotion here, but I really do think Cherry Hill has a good program with their Master of Divinity in Pastoral Counseling and Chaplaincy. And I do say that from somebody who really discerned where would I like to do my education and was willing to travel, willing to pay, willing to do what was necessary to get the best education that I could. And what I really appreciate about Cherry Hill, and this is true of their program, but is also true of other programs as well, if you're discerning and looking for it, is that their pastoral counseling and chaplaincy program has a lot of behavioral sciences in it. It has a lot of psychology, it has the legal, it has the ethics, right? It also has a way to interact with theological formation that's very true to you as an individual. So rather than teaching you theology, it is about fostering exploration of theology. So for example, when I was in my residency, I was there with a number of folks who had MDivs from mainline denomination seminaries, and they could tell me about ancient Greek. They could read biblical Hebrew. They could tell me about concupiscence in their religious worldview, but they couldn't recognize some of the telltale signs of bipolar 2 and how that might affect someone when you're alone with them in the emergency department. Whereas I was taking classes that addressed that, and I was able to take what I was learning and immediately apply it to a clinical setting. So that was a good litmus test too when you're looking at a program to say, is what I'm learning going to be pretty much immediately applicable to the setting I want to work in?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I wonder if somebody would like to, Ben, maybe you, since you'd probably be up next, describe CPE for people who may not know what it is and what you might expect if you decide you're going to do that.
Yeah, so CPE, I do want to make sure that it's clear that I strongly recommend doing CPE. As Bryce put it, I think very well. Whether or not CPE is actually a requirement is going to depend on what specific kind of chaplaincy you want to do. It is required for hospital chaplains.
Hang on just a second, Ben.
It's going to depend a lot.
Hold on just a minute. Let's let the bandwidth catch up. Okay, so it's going to be required for hospitals. And maybe
hospitals.
Just to reiterate, CPE stands for clinical pastoral education. So it's like a residency.
Yeah, so so usually so for most medical chaplains are going to probably have to have some, but in other settings you may or may not be asked to do some.
And why would that be important in a medical setting?
Well, it started in medical settings is the short answer to that. And it is so the approach of CPE is that generally it's in medical setting, often a hospital setting. And what you do is you work part-time or sometimes even close to full-time as a chaplain, and while also receiving education, didactic education, doing reading, going to lectures, things like that, about various topics pertaining to providing spiritual care in a hospital. And then you also, sort of the bread and butter of it, I think, is that it's also a venue where you are put into sort of intense group interactions of various sorts with other people going through the CPE process. And that is a way of getting to know yourself better, getting to know the diversity of different people that might be doing this work better. And those are sort of the essential skills of chaplaincy. I will say that I did CPE 10 years ago, so I think talking to younger chaplains or newer chaplains, sometimes it seems like some things in the culture have shifted. But certainly when I did it, it was still very focused on that sort of interpersonal group, encounter group kind of model. That is used to be considered kind of the core of it.
Okay. Wes, do you want to say anything about your experience?
Sure. I think that there are some options when you think of CPE. So you can find sort of more part-time opportunities that might stretch out over 6 months, and you may go in 2 days a week. But you also have homework still and education where you have to get together with your other fellow students and your supervisor. So it's still a commitment, even at that sort of part-time approach. And then there's also full-time where you're working full-time, you have benefits, you're in the hospital, you're being paid. Not much. CPE does not pay. You're not there to earn money, but you get so much out of it to then go forward in your career as a chaplain. And those residencies are intense. I think that's pretty much regardless of where you work or which hospital and so on, because it's full time. There's homework. You're overnight. Your weekends. You're working holidays. You're running the hospital as far as chaplaincy goes, and sometimes you might be the only chaplain in the hospital in the middle of the night in a emergency room, and all hell breaks loose. So it doesn't happen all the time, but you kind of have to be prepared for that. And that's what the education is for, is, you're not just thrown out there to the wolves, so to speak. The training helps you manage those kinds of situations and know what to do and what your role is and what you're not there to do. Sometimes it's as a CPE student, you end up educating the hospital staff about what your role is and what it isn't. I think that's probably all I would say.
Okay. One observation I made on my few trips to hospitals is they kind of count on the chaplains to know where it's okay to go and when you need to stay out of the way. Am I right? And yeah, what to do if somebody codes or there's an emergency. I know when I've acted like a chaplain many years ago and just slipped into ICU with somebody, a friend was dying and his wife wanted me to be there. They left me alone until another family came in next to us and was making a racket. And then they kind of apologized because they felt like they had to ask me to leave with the others. But the first thing they asked me was I a chaplain? So that's when I kind of got it. Oh, some of this is about learning hospital or prison or whatever procedures. Am I right?
I'll say that's was true for me, at least when I did my first unit of CPE. It was extended over 6 months, and one of the biggest challenges for me at the time was just getting used to having sort of a free reign of the hospital. I was used to being someone who visits someone, and I was always afraid of being in the doctor's way or whatever. But you're a part of the staff as a chaplain, and as your education, you learn kind of where to go, where not to go, etc. Every hospital is different from what I understand, and yeah, I mean, as long as you're conducting yourself in a professional way, no one's really going to question what you're doing.
Somebody has put a question that I think would be good for y'all to hear. Has anybody got suggestions for completing CPE while working full-time in a position where I can't afford to leave my current job, but would love to complete CPE units? So maybe some advice on that. And also, I'm wondering if the person posing the question needs CPE. And so you might comment on when CPE is important and when it's kind of the next step to becoming a professional. Bryce?
I'm happy to kind of tackle both of those. To be perfectly honest, from my own bias, if you're working in chaplaincy, any non-faith-based chaplaincy, you need CPE. That is firmly a belief of mine. There are not requirements for some places in chaplaincy to have CPE, but if you're working outside of your own religious context, I do believe you need CPE. And even within your own faith context, CPE is valuable. In terms of how to balance it with full-time, that was my problem when I first decided to get into chaplaincy. I worked full-time. I worked for a large tech company. We were coming up on COVID. I was working 12 to 16 hours a day. I thought, how am I going to find CPE? And there's been a change in the CPE industry where they're offering more and more extended units, like Wes was saying, where instead of coming together for 2.5 months to work every day, you might be stretched over 6 months, or I had units that were stretched over 9 months. So I was able to find an extended unit program that I was able to do on the weekends. So I was able to work my 9 to at that point, probably 9 to 8, 9 to 10:30 job, and then go into CPE on the weekends there and make that sustainable. It is tricky to find programs like that, but they are out there. There are more and more programs for full-time working adults. One of the places I recommend people look at is acpe.edu. So ACPE is the Association of Clinical Pastoral Education. They have a directory on there, and it can be helpful to search for that directory for extended programs that are offered either online or in your area. And that's another good thing to keep in mind too, is that we've seen more and more CPE go online. And that means that the cohort is all over the United States, sometimes all over the world, and they meet for didactics online as a group, but then they have placement within their respective communities. And sometimes that's in a healthcare center. Other times there have been CPE programs that allow community placement. So placement within a faith program, placement within a social services program. So there's a lot of flexibility out there. You just kind of have to ask questions.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And I see you've put in the chat the name of one of these, Sankofa. And I know the first time I heard about online CPE, I was like, how could that be? It's supposed to be a supervised internship, but that is, especially since COVID, is becoming more common, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. I'll add, Holly, that if someone is not sure they can balance that, try calling the hospital if there's a program you're aware of. Look up the head chaplain, perhaps, or the educator, and just ask them, how many hours a week are we talking? And so on, and just ask real practical questions. Or if you go as far as putting in an application and you get to an interview, then use your interview to ask those kinds of things. Because I've seen people who thought they could handle it, and everyone's different, but then they couldn't quite make it work, and they had to drop it, which is, if that's what they need to do, that's okay. But it can be really stressful if you're trying to juggle all that, all those demands of family, children, work, driving time. That's a big thing too. It took me almost an hour to get to one of my hospitals. And sometimes the traffic was hellacious. So you have to take all that into consideration and be really practical.
Thank you. Bryce?
Sorry to jump back in here. I just had something to remember and then it slipped my mind and it's back. So I figured now is probably better to just run with it. So the drive time, yes, absolutely. I think it's, since we're here on behalf of CoG and the Grand Council, right? Finding a good CPE program is a lot like finding a good coven. I had a CPE program that I did for a year that was 3 hours away from my house. So you might have to relocate for a little bit. You might have to travel and grin and bear it. It's very rare that you'll find one close to home that actually fits your needs. Um, the thing that I wanted to make sure I mentioned too is that even though CPE programs generally follow the same sort of rubric, the same sort of standards, they're all different, right? There's a lot of flexibility within CPE that's based upon the educator who's in charge of the CPE unit and what their theory of learning is and how the cohort needs that learning to come about. So you might find one CPE cohort and educator is just not good and does not align with what you're looking for. And you might find some that are really amazing. And so that interview process is really important for you as much as it is for them to figure out what am I getting into. And while I did mention ACPE, that's kind of the easiest organization to find, there are other organizations as well that offer CPE. So the clinical training, or excuse me, the Chaplaincy Training Institute is another one that's associated with the Spiritual Care Association. But what you want to be careful for is make sure that if you're doing a CPE program, that program is through ACPE or the Chaplaincy Leadership Institute or whatever program that is sanctioned, whatever body that's sanctioned by, that body has some sort of endorsing body behind it or connected to it. Because there are also places out there that provide CPE, but that CPE is not accredited really by anybody. And so they're kind of free floating and some places will not take that as a valid credit.
Okay. Keith or Ben, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I don't know that I have a lot to add to what we've been saying. I do agree that you should be aware of what CPE program you're getting into and ask good questions. I think to the question about fitting it in with full-time work, I I think that's always going to be a challenge, as it is with anytime you're trying to transition. But I think that the thing that I would say to that is, make sure you just talk to the educator about what your situation is. And because they do, as I think as Bryce was saying, or maybe Wes, they have a lot of latitude in terms of how they choose to approach CPE. And so you'll definitely find supervisors out there that are like, no, I need you to be able to be available to sleep overnight in the hospital like 2 nights a week. And if you can't make that commitment, then you can't do CPE here. And you'll find others that are like, oh no, we'll work with your circumstances and make adjustments because I really think you'd be an interesting student, and so I want you to be here. And it really just depends on the supervisor.
Thank you. Lisa has a couple of good questions. She says, let's talk money. How well paid is this career? Because honestly, where we're moving, I need to consider my employment if we want to keep the lights on. She also asked, do you think your religion as pagan has affected your ability to find work? And if so, positively or negatively?
Okay, I'll jump into to that. I think the money is going to vary a lot. Generally, I can't really get too specific about it because I've seen all sorts of things. Generally, the best paid positions are going to be, in my experience, at large academic teaching hospitals. So wherever you're moving, those are probably the best paid positions. Other things pay less. So if it's a smaller hospital, if it's a hospice organization, but it will depend a lot on what the market in the area is for chaplains. Without getting into I do not find it difficult to maintain a fairly decent middle class income as a chaplain. We live in the Northeast, so I'll say my wife makes more than I do as a school teacher. but that's because school teachers are actually paid really well in the Northeast, which is not true in most of the rest of the country. And almost anywhere else, I would probably be paid quite a lot more than she was. In terms of, I think that in terms of the question of whether it's to your advantage or to your disadvantage to be pagan, I think that the kind of the irony there is it's probably to your advantage in terms of finding CPE units, because there are definitely CPE supervisors out there that want diversity. A lot of them want diversity, and so you will be attractive to them as somebody that can come and challenge their other students. But then once you get out into the world of actually trying to find work, there are definitely institutions that will not hire you if they know you are pagan. And so that gets into the question of how do you go about presenting yourself. So I'm endorsed by an interfaith organization. So when I'm applying for a job, as I had to recently, I present myself as an interfaith minister. And I don't usually bring up the word pagan until after people know me a little better.
Thank you. Bryce?
These are all questions that I have had as I was going through my chaplaincy training of like, oh my gosh, will I have a sustainable career? And will anybody even let me work for them, given my religious background? So I really appreciate these. In my area, I have found that hospice and healthcare settings of chaplaincy, usually the starting wage or starting salary will go between 45 and 65,000 a year. We do have I have several friends who are with the Wisconsin Department of Corrections, and they typically start at around 85,000 a year. And I'm in kind of south central Wisconsin, and that's where our wages typically go. And as I've looked elsewhere, it seems to be about comparable in many healthcare settings, that it's kind of between that $27 and $33 per hour mark for a full-time chaplain there. And then in terms of the religious affiliation affecting ability to find a job. So this one I have a soapbox on. But what what I will say, chaplaincy is very interesting in that there is that question of, is this a religious vocation or is this a spiritual care vocation? And different institutions are going to term it differently. So if you're applying for a job at a privately held institution that has a faith base to it, they are okay to ask you your religion, and they are okay to deny your hire or terminate your position based on your religion legally because of their faith affiliation working from that. If you are at a public job or something that's not related to a faith group, they may or may not have the right to terminate your position or deny you hire based upon your religion, depending on how they define what chaplaincy is in the job description. So I always think it's very important to look through what is the job description and see if there's anything related to religion in there. I always make sure to know the policies and procedures ahead of time if I can. Because of connections, I can generally get policies and procedures on discrimination and harassment within the workplace based upon religious affiliation. And I personally don't give out my religious identity, just like I don't give out my sexual identity during interviews or during any sort of workplace information collecting, because that is private information and not any of their business. So I may have a little stricter stance on that than some people, but I am also very much for workers' rights, and it's my right to keep my private information private.
Thank you. Keith, Keith, did you have anything you wanted to share?
Now, it's interesting that Bryce says it that way, because I have been working with one of the local hospitals as they're wanting to hire a chaplain. And the funny part is they brought me in as the clinical consultant for the position, yet I've ended up being something of the spiritual consultant for the position. And to go with what Bryce said, be aware a lot of them are wanting some kind of mental health or medical or services background. So be very, very picky about what services you can provide, how you can meet their requirements. I believe I can say, at least in this area, they are going more toward a chaplaincy background that has other things: medical, mental, behavioral, something. You don't have to have a degree, but you do need to show you have something there.
Wes?
So my experience in some of this was a little all over the place with regarding money and also, reaction to me being a pagan. I was initially worried that I would have a problem finding a CPE unit, being Pagan. When I applied for my year-long residency, I applied to 5 different hospitals, and I was kind of trying to hedge my bets. And fortunately, I didn't have a problem. They were all very eager. I got an offer from all 5, which was great. And I will say in one of those, it was a very large teaching hospital in Kentucky, and they were very curious about my paganism. Lots of questions in a room of like 13 people. They were very official. They all had lab coats on, this big boardroom, and there I was with 13 people kind of grilling me about being pagan. But I guess I did well. But then when it came to money, I actually chose the program that paid the most. There were some other reasons, but it worked out that they also paid the most money. And so that was great. Then once that ended and I started looking for work, I really had a hard time getting an interview. And I began to wonder if it was because I was pagan, because like I think Bryce mentioned, once you start to work, it could be a little different than being in an educational setting where they're like, oh, sure, we're all about diversity. So again, I don't know if that was a factor, but it did cross my mind. But what happened is I was hired back at the hospital where I had done my residency. So they already knew I was pagan. And fortunately, I guess I'd had a good enough reputation that they wanted me to come back. But when I was hired, I wasn't hired full time. One thing that a lot of chaplains do that hasn't been mentioned is we work PRN. It's a medical term, Latin, not really important, but it basically means as needed. And nurses work PRN, some doctors do, and so on. So it's just very typical in a hospital. So you don't have a guaranteed schedule. You just go in when they need you. And it will vary based on where you are, your hospital, so on. That usually pays very little per hour. It's like an hourly position, and so on. And as for me, I began to realize that, partly because I guess where I lived, and so on, there weren't going to be that many options. It was more competitive, perhaps. There probably were more chaplains applying than there were job openings. And so my only option was PRN, which by the time I drove that long distance and worked, I was beginning to think this might not be the best long-term option for me. And that's part of the reason why I retired when I did. So you just, again, there aren't a lot of hard and fast rules, but you do have to really ask your questions. And the more people you meet who work in chaplaincy or who do CPE, ask them out for a coffee. Hey, tell me what this is like in this city, or tell me what it's like in this hospital. What are the opportunities out there, so that you can find something that works for your particular situation.
We've got just a few more minutes. I'd like to say something for people who don't want or don't are at a point in their life where they're not going to go to school and get a master's and do CPE, but maybe you volunteer in a prison, or for whatever reason you need some non-professional chops. And we do have a program called the Community Ministry Certificate, which touches on all the subjects that we think are important for somebody who's doing some kind of ministry out there, including these things that have been mentioned about chaplaincy today: mental health, addictions, family dynamics, groups and leadership, boundaries and ethics. That's probably the biggest. So we try not to hawk Cherry Hill too much here, but that's something that I think people should know about. And I want to, in the 5 or 6 minutes we've got left, is there anybody who's got a question for this panel, or a comment, a burning desire to share? Wow. So y'all are ready to take the break, huh? I want to thank each of you Bryce, Ben, Keith, and Wes. Oh, Bryce?
Holly, we've got
Sorry,
a, oh, you see, okay, Heather has her.
Oh,
her
we do
hand.
have somebody. Okay. Yeah, please.
I just want to be the cautionary tale for everybody. I had somebody who was very excited about having a Jew and a pagan in the CPE cohort, the first non-Christians, and both of us ended up filing ethics complaints, and I've been unable to find a job. So I just want to say, be very, very careful. You know, it's cost me a lot to file that complaint and to stand up for what's right. It's the right thing to do. I'm not going to not do it. It also means I'm sitting here with 5 units of CPE and MDiv on and on and on, and not eligible for a position. So I just be very, very, you know, there are a lot of horror tales out there, and having lived a really horrific experience, just please do a lot of research, talk to people, be very, very careful. Just
Thank you, Heather.
I've had 2 rough years because of the CPE, so I just, from the bottom of my heart, for all my pagan dearest, please be very careful and take care of yourself with it.
I'm so sorry. I know we all are.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing.
I just want to say thank you for, if I can, I'll just say thank you for sharing that, and also just echo that I've been a chaplain for about a decade now, and I have heard a lot of CPE horror stories. So I do think there's a lot of value in CPE, but do ask around about the programs that you're looking at, because I've heard some things that are really not great about different programs, and there are wonderful programs out there, but just like anything else, there are some really unethical people. And I would go ahead and ask somebody, if you're thinking about doing CPE, you know, how have other pagans, or even how have other people from minority religions done in this program? And if they're saying, well, you'd be the first and we're really excited about that, that's something to kind of pay attention to, because especially if they haven't had any pagans, that's not surprising. We're a very small part of the situation, part of the population. But why haven't they had any Jewish chaplains before now? That's a little bit odd, because there are a lot of Jewish people in this country. Why have they not had any Muslim or Buddhist chaplains? So
Thank you. Lisa.
Hi. So I started doing volunteer prison chaplaincy in like 2005, and I backed off in 2013 when my grandson was born. It's about the only reason I would have stopped doing it, but my daughter needed me. So what I wanted to say was I have been involved in being subpoenaed for a lawsuit on behalf of a pagan who's incarcerated because he was suing to have religious artifacts. What I mean by that is stuff they're allowed to have in their cell. So can you have a candle in your cell? No. Can you have something that represents a candle? Yes, you know, stuff like that. And one of the things that I got asked very frequently was, do they really need this in order to worship? You know, and my first answer would be, and this is in the real world, don't quote me on this because I won't be quoted. I will deny saying this. I know it's recorded. Don't tell them you don't need anything to practice your faith, because the minute you do that, you create a precedent. And you know what? If the Catholics need to have a cross, then we can have a religious implement that is equivalent. And that was one of the things that the Muslim chaplain, who is my supervisor, who I met through the Interfaith Council, again, connections, told me was, you know, well, if the chaplains can have candles in the chapel, then so can you, Lisa. So he made sure that I could bring candles in with me and light candles so that I could do that. I had to have, and every single time I went inside, I had to have a copy of the Department Operations Manual addendum that was signed by the warden, because every time they take a copy of it, they say, oh, I don't have a copy of that. I'm like, yeah, you've only photocopied it the last 5 times I've been in here, but okay, here you go. And then they'd give it back to me. But the thing is, don't let somebody write you or call you or tell you that they're not allowed to have something, they don't need to have it, because the minute you do that, and again, I was subpoenaed about that, then you create a precedent, and other pagans that come after them won't be allowed it. So if in the court ruling that they made, I had said, because he said, the judge asked me, he said, well, Lisa, can you come up with, the 7 most common oils that a Wiccan would use? And my answer was, and Goddess bless Pagan Patrick McCullum for telling me this. He said, because he told me, if you say anything, it's going to go, and it'll be a precedent. I said, I don't think I could give you 7 oils, because my book of shadows in my tradition, majestic tradition, which is the only tradition in which I am an expert, has anywhere from 75 to about 250 oils. I don't know. I don't have it on me right now, but there's no way I could just give you 7. And that was, of course, not the answer the judge wanted, but that was the right answer, because if I say only these 7 oils, then that's the only 7 oils that particular pagan person who's incarcerated would be allowed to have. And that's also the case with military. When you have a chaplain asking you as an expert in your tradition, do you need this to practice? Usually the answer is no, but you need to think back and think, well, we do use that in practice. That is how I practice, or I don't practice that way. I know many others who do practice that way. So yes, that's a valid part of practice. Now it's up to the hospital or the prison or the military to determine the safety and security of their own facilities and what they can allow someone to have, in barracks, in cell, or whatever. That's up to them. But whether or not it's important, that comes back to you. And I hear a lot of people say a differing opinion than mine, and I need to make it really clear that you are not doing any of our armed forces members or anyone in a hospital or anyone who's incarcerated any service by denying someone, if I need a high-heeled shoe to worship my deity, then maybe I get a Barbie shoe. Okay? Maybe I get a Barbie shoe, because what it is, and you got to look it up, Religious Land and Institutional Persons Act. It's RLUIPA, RLUIPA. Yeah, that is what gives you a lot of outline. But basically, is it a sincere faith? Hearly Bell. If I have a sincerely held belief in a goddess who is recognized by a high-heeled shoe, then I get that. So please, 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 if I do nothing else in this particular workshop, then hammer home how important that is to everyone in this workshop. That's my big religious button. So thanks for listening.
Thank you. And I appreciate it.
I have to add to
We're
that.
over time.
I still
Mama,
have to add.
1 minute.
Okay.
Go for it.
I can be fast. That one wasn't fast, but I can be fast. Hematite Inmate Ministry had a talk by an attorney who works on civil rights stuff and who happens to be related to Patrick McCullum. It was recorded and it's available to members only. It's not available to the public, members of Hematite, about the current religious laws in terms of what's allowed for prisoners. And it specifically, she asked us, we had a gathering to talk with her because she was subpoenaed by the Civil Rights Commission of the United States of America, and she went to Washington, D.C. to testify about how these recent Supreme Court rulings, including RLUIPA, had been implemented. And Ariadne's right. You can't. There's a case in Nevada where a Wiccan inmate wanted access to a sweat lodge. I think most of us would say, oh, we don't need a sweat lodge. But here's the key ruling from the Supreme Court is if it's a sincerely held religious belief. And the people who have to prove the sincerity of that religious belief are the authorities who are attempting to deny whatever it is. So the key word is sincerely held religious belief. And if this guy has a sincerely held religious belief, he gets a sweat lodge, they got to give him one. So, and there's citations for all those cases. If you should happen to join us at Hematite, you'll have access to this stuff. But I was pretty proud because she wanted to have the
people who are actually in the prisons doing the volunteer work give her feedback so she could then testify to the Civil Rights Commission. So.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. We are now officially over by just a little bit. So let's end this one right now. And thanking our panelists once again, Bryce, Keith, Wes, and Ben, and be back here at 3:15 Eastern Time, which I believe is 12:15 Pacific, and whatever might be in between. Thanks.
Thank you, Holly, for remembering the recording. Right, do we have everyone? We do. All right. Welcome back, everyone. Our final panel for today is called Reclaiming, Restoring, Releasing Our Former Religions. Our panel would like to welcome back Holly, Candace, Wes, and Cedar. Thank you again so much for joining us and talking to us about these important topics. Yeah, again, if you've got any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I'll try to monitor the chat, but we'll also have some time at the end of the panel to answer any questions that you might have had. So, all right, so we'll jump right in. Our first question is, why is it so hard for us to disentangle ourselves from our previous religion? And we'll stop at the top of, or start at the top of my screen with Candace.
I had a feeling you were going to go to me first.
You just happen to be right there at the top. So,
so I'd already unmuted. So, and I was thinking about that. I mean, I was raised in a Christian household, Methodist, and went through various phases with that, sometimes trying to be a good Christian, sometimes just ignoring it completely. But I think it's been probably 24, 25 years since I left it finally. But I think what we were, I don't want to say brainwashed, but maybe indoctrinated with as children will stick with you for a long, long time. You don't get rid of that easily. And we live in a culture that is, whether we like it or not, is predominantly Christian. So it's everywhere. It's everywhere. It's in your entertainment, in your social media. When you drive down the street, there's a church on every street corner. So, I mean, you can't kind of avoid it. So it's no surprise that it's hard to shake it off.
Absolutely. I mean, if you think about it, even our schools, our public schools, which are supposed to be free from religion, even just the choral groups, the band groups, they all have some religious component sometimes within them. Thank you. Cedar.
Yeah, I think that in my experience, and maybe for a lot of other people, I think changing religions often comes in the middle, often of other life crises. Not always, but often, and can involve a lot of rupture, right? A lot of rupture in perhaps your community life, whatever your religious community was, for sure. Sometimes family. For me, I was ordained in the Episcopal Church, and as time went on and I had conversations with my bishop, and bishops changed, there's a lot of space in the Episcopal Church for parishioners to have various religious affiliations and multiple religious identities. There's a lot more pressure on clergy not to have those. And there's been, a couple of instances in my diocese where people with multiple religious identities lost their ordination. And it also, and so I think everybody has their own story with it, but I do think that it often comes at a time of rupture for people. And so it often is part of this larger deconstruction that people do of maybe their identity, their place in the world. And I think it can come with profound loss, loss of community, or for me, like loss of family of origin, all of those things. So I think that, changing religion often comes with a lot of other change in people's lives.
Thank you. Thank you. And I think, and don't mean to jump in as the moderator, but I actually just organized and planned my mother's funeral. And in that process, even though she was Presbyterian light, actually, I had to go back and I relied on the music that I heard as a child as a way of comforting, because so it's that disruption, but also coming back from when your life is disrupted. Wes.
Thanks, Margo. Yeah, I think it's kind of related to what others have said already, but like you talked about the music that you grew up hearing, and so when you're a child and you're raised in a religious household, whatever the religion might be, that is your whole world. That's your how the world makes sense, how you understand it, how your family understand it. So it's just this constantly self-reinforced system, and that if you stick with it for any time at all, I mean, that becomes your whole life. And so if you change it, that's a big deal. That's incredible change. You potentially could lose your family, friends, your whole social network. People could look at you differently where you work, because if you have that in common with them where you work, then that's a different change. Friendships, I mean, it just can really permeate everything, for good and bad. So I think that's a big reason why it's so hard to if we use those words, release, restore, etc. I mean, that is why it's so hard, I think.
Thank you.
Can I just add that it all kind of blends in with all of the things that you're here as a child? I have to confess, I still kind of believe in Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny. Those, I don't want to give them up, okay?
Don't forget the tooth fairy.
Yes, very important.
Although
even though
Pagan.
I was the tooth fairy, with my two kids. So
Sure. Holly.
Yeah, I echo what other people have said, that it's there's a lot of fear. What if you're wrong? You go through denial most of the time for a while. Oh, I just misunderstood, or that was just a misunderstanding, or that's not really what they meant. And you finally have to come to terms with that. And then I think most of us are angry. And we run into that a lot with students. Some of you've heard me say that, there has come a time with a couple of folks where I had to say, look, you've got a big chip on your shoulder against Christianity, and you're not going to be able to do anything until you deal with that. But that's hard to do. I'm meeting tomorrow with some people who've been really hurt by their religion, not Christianity. And it's been something like 4 or 5 years. And they reached out to me and said, I think it's time for us to start healing. So there's a lot of cognitive, but it's really more on the emotional level. And healing just takes as much time as it takes. Some people come to their religion intellectually, and that's fine. But most of us, it's really a deeply embedded cultural and family and emotional thing. And that's a lot harder to not just release, but come to terms with, which is kind of what we meant by this title. Reclaiming would be about reclaiming your own feelings. My feelings about this are valid. And restoring is restoring your sense of self, your sense of integrity, that you can figure things out and what you think about things is valid. And then the releasing is the healing part. So it's a big journey.
Thank you, Holly. And to kind of piggyback on that, if I could just stay with you for a moment for this next question, because this leads right into it, is what can we do to make this less painful and less confusing for people who do decide to make that change?
Did Wes get a chance to talk?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Do you want to answer that, Holly, or do you want me to jump to some? Candace, you just turned off your mic. I'll let you jump in there. There you go.
Well, I think you, I don't really know how to express this well, but I think maybe a first step is to take a deep dive into your former religion and the things that about it that don't work. And I was looking at my books. I've got, I don't know how many books here about basically monotheisms. Trusting Doubt, written by Valerie Terrico, who was an evangelical and has left it. Books by Dan Barker, Freedom from Religion Foundation. Books by D.M. Murdoch. You know, maybe it's because I'm a history prof, so I go to books first and I read and read and read and read. And you come up with all these facts. You say, oh, really? That's where they got them. Oh, they don't know who wrote all those books of the Bible. And you look at it from that way, and it is a deep dive, but it also is a way of kind of working it out, I guess. Working it out. You know, a few years ago, I was stung by a scorpion, which is not unusual here in Las Vegas. Scorpion had come in, was on the carpet, same color as the carpet. I'm barefoot because I don't wear shoes in the house. And I stepped on the scorpion. The scorpion did what a scorpion does. It stung me. So, okay. And when a scorpion stings you, you know it, you feel it. Believe me. It's like a knife jab. So I hopped back to the computer and I Googled, what do you do for a scorpion bite? And Google so nicely told me, scorpions don't bite, they sting. Well, okay, what do I do about it? So they said, wash it out, put some ice on it, and wait for the pain to go away. And that has actually been my instructions for life. When you have something that hurts you, wash it out. And so my reading the books is washing it out. Put some ice on it. Okay, numb it a little bit. Wait for the pain to go away. And I really think that's kind of works in most situations. It may not go all the way away. It may always be with you.
Thank you. Cedar?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. I think first, for me, it has been really helpful to think of kind of the larger cultural shifts that are happening, and seeing myself as part of that. I don't know, I feel less alone in that. And recognizing that people who are either identifying with multiple traditions and religions or transitioning from one religion to another, that this is happening. This is something that's happening widely in Western culture right now. I am moving to study in Ireland this fall. And it's a really interesting, Ireland's in a really interesting space religiously right now, as a predominantly Catholic country for a very, really long time, but increased interest in paganism and increased like kind of, there's kind of a widespread kind of cultural sense of transition away from Catholicism, but not entirely away, right? Not quite sure what that looks like, but there's this cultural rupture happening that, you know, that people are struggling with and asking about. And I think, you know, I think that for me, it's interesting to watch those larger trends and to see myself, of course, myself in the US context as part of that. It also helps me. I think one of the things that I have struggled with, right, is feeling like that asking questions and changing doesn't mean that you are lacking integrity, right? That this is part of a human process, right? That humans change. Transformation is part of the human experience. So all of those things helped. And another thing that's helped really tremendously for me is to find spaces to learn. Cherry Hill was a really great resource for me. Somebody just mentioned the Irish Pagan School in the comments. Spaces where that are designed for people learning about different things, learning new traditions, designed for exploration, for people to find paths that work for them. I think making those spaces in this particular time is really, really important. And like, I think all of those things have supported me. And of course, finding support in the faith traditions themselves. And just recognizing that transformation can be a painful thing, and also a really rewarding thing, that, you know, that it's all part of the process. So yeah.
All right, thank you.
It looks
Holly,
like,
did we lose
Candace,
Candace?
it looks like she lost her connection. Will you keep an eye out
Sure
and
will.
spotlight her if she comes back in?
Yeah, and just to clarify, you know, we know that, oh, there she is. Yeah. There you go. You know, not everyone goes through the more traumatic process of, you know, going from one religious perspective to another, or losing their religion or anything like that. As a, you know, I mentioned growing up Presbyterian, it's one of those things where I just felt like I was wearing a pair of shoes that just didn't fit. And it wasn't anything wrong with the shoes, they just weren't for me. And so it was not as dramatic as whereas other people did obviously have that and that issue. And we have so many people that are you know, have converted, for lack of a better word, right, to some form of paganism, just to clarify that component. So I think I was at Holly. So how do we make this process less painful and less confusing?
Well, I've been divorced more than once, and a lot of people have compared this process to divorce, because it really is in many ways a breakup of your chosen family. And my experience during divorce, I know this is not everybody's, but I think it's pretty common, is that all your friends scatter because they don't want to be seen as taking sides. And so what they do is they abandon both of you, or both parties. And I definitely was shunned by my Christian community in the early mid-'80s. And interestingly, somebody found me online a couple of years ago, and she went to a lot of trouble to reach out to me, and she had been a member of that group. And so we caught up, and it was like a reunion, and I got caught up on who's dead, who's had a baby, you know, a lot of stuff. But she had always felt uncomfortable about how I was treated. So that helped me process a lot of my past grief and make some sense of it, but we don't all get that opportunity. So I think that the first thing is you got to give yourself some time. And when I say give yourself, I'm also talking about the people that we end up in contact with. You can't just say, oh yeah, hell, that was a terrible religion, or you had a crummy experience. I mean, maybe those may or may not both be true, but the thing is to just be with people, just like that chaplaincy thing. Just be there, hold their hand, buy them a milkshake, you know, watch a movie with them, whatever, help them get through that initial grief. But eventually they probably want to process this stuff and talk about it. And I would say, don't just look at what the problems and disappointments were. Recognize those have to be recognized. But also look at what was it that drew you in the first place. And these are kind of personal inventories that might need to be done in journaling, you know. And then what do you still find helpful? Because that became part of our cultural, deeply embedded background. And you don't have to, as Anne, it's embarrassing. Anyway, as Anne out there on the West Coast said in her little book a few years ago, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. So those are my practical suggestions.
And Hill.
Anne Hill, thank you, I knew that. do those personal inventories and then go back through them again and work with those things. And that's where somebody like a pastoral counselor or a spiritual director might be helpful, because 99% of their job is going to be listening to you and just asking questions that kind of help nudge you to the next step.
Thank you very much. Go ahead, Wes. Did you have something to add?
Yeah, I'll say, with one thing I think that can be helpful is when you've decided, okay, I'm leaving this religion, whatever it is, you need to, I think, give others grace, if I can use that word, if it's a Christian word, but I think it's give others a break who may not understand. I know when I left the church that I was part of, Christian church, they were great people. It really had nothing to do with them. It was more theological and personal stuff. So, but someone said to me, well, are you just trying to be different? And it really kind of pissed me off. But I didn't, lash back or say anything, because if they don't understand, they're not going to understand. And I know that can be really hard if your close family is that way. But I think you just have to understand that, look, this is your journey, and they may not understand and they may not respect it. And you kind of have to, you can't make them do something that they can't do. You have to be willing to, if this is your chosen path, you have to be willing to walk that and sort of, chin up, etc. And maybe they'll come around later. But again, you can't really control that. So, and I see some people, especially pagans and their family's Christian, and there's this constant, battle and everything. And I know that's family dynamics, but I feel like sometimes it's the person who's pagan for like, I'm demanding that you respect me, and I'm demanding that, all these things. And you have to find a way through that. You have to kind of find a way. I'm going to practice regardless of what my family does or my friends do, and be willing to let some of those people go. The friendship may change, the family relationship may change, and that's unfortunate. But sometimes, it isn't your fault. Hopefully, it's not necessarily your fault, but these things can happen and people don't understand, and it's going to change the nature of those relationships. And I think being able or being willing to maybe not let them go, but if they just change a little bit, I think that's one way to make it easier on yourself instead of trying to keep things the way they have always been.
Great, thank you so much. So switching gears a little bit here, and talking about how, did your former religion play a role, either positively or negatively, in your decision to become pagan, and however that happened? We'll start with Candace. Welcome back.
Thank you. I seem to have some internet issues today. So I don't think that my former religion played much of a role, except that, as I came to a point in my life when it seemed to me that they were talking the talk but not walking the walk. They were acting very unchristian-like, in my opinion, and sort of, kind of opened the door for me to leave, really. So yes, in that sense, true. Yeah.
Thank you. Cedar.
I think I would say that my former religion played both a positive and negative role in my decision to become pagan. I think, like I said, I'd practiced both for a long time. There's a lot of tradition, like there's a lot of mystical traditions in Christianity, all the way from, Teresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross to, more modern expressions of Celtic Christianity. And I think that those those traditions definitely did and continue to play a role in kind of how I practice and see faith in general. I think the more negative aspect perhaps is, I think for me, it was really hard to grapple with Christianity's, kind of long history of colonization and empire building, like that history and kind of the theology that comes out of that history. Like from an ideological standpoint, from like my own wrestling with faith tradition. And I think ultimately it was really difficult to the negative parts of Christianity that really pushed me away from the tradition was transitioning. And as a trans person, just the kind of general negativity that Christianity, even progressive Christianity, kind of has around human sexuality in general, I think became too much. It just became too much for me. I think that, even in progressive Christianity, it can be kinder and gentler in a lot of ways. But the demand, there's still I felt a lot of demand for self-sacrifice and just harm to me in those concepts. So I would say, it played both a positive and negative role. I still, even as I've left the tradition, I still remain friends and partners and community partners and all of that with many people and with many progressive Christians and all of that. But I think my former religion played both a positive and negative role in adopting paganism in my own life.
Thank you, Cedar. Wes?
Yeah, I think I'd have to agree with Cedar's experience, and mine was a little positive and negative. I think for me, the biggest thing was questioning a lot of Christianity. I mean, I grew up in more of a fundamentalist kind of background, and you couldn't question anything. And and even as I changed churches and I became more of a progressive Christian, there were still, they would question things, but up to a point. And I just wanted to go further. It wasn't good enough for me. And I began to have some spiritual experiences that just didn't fit within Christianity, no matter how hard I tried. And I tried to make it fit. And I was like, why am I even trying? Why do I have to do this? And also being queer too, that was for a while, I would even say, oh, I'm going to remain a Christian and I'm going to try to change the organization from within and and all that. And then I thought, I'm too tired to do this anymore. I don't even care. Like, y'all just work it out. I'm going elsewhere. And so when I, found paganism, it took some time, but I thought, oh, here's, these people that I'm already there. Like I was already pagan in my thoughts and what I was looking for, and just didn't know it existed. And so I thought, for me, it was like, why waste any more time doing this other thing that just doesn't mean anything to me anymore?
Could I just jump in there and also mention that the patriarchal structure of the Christian church? I mean, I'm a woman. I teach women's studies at the college level. And, I can see this patriarchal structure and the lack of women in leadership and decision-making positions. And yeah, Wes, I mean, yeah, some people have decided to try and stay and change it, but it doesn't really change. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I've talked to a lot of women the same way. There's a struggle there to not see that that component in our faith. Holly.
My short answer is no, it did not. But I think that by leaving, and it took me a while. I kept telling myself, don't hold God's people against him. Of course, yeah, you kind of have to say that with any religion, don't you? But what it did was it freed me up to remember who I had been before I had this born again thing happen to me. And that was nature. So that began my return to something that I eventually recognized as whatever it was that my CUPS acquaintances did in that other building in the church. That's it.
Thank you. So our next question, if you think of reclaiming or restoring or releasing your former religion, what does that mean to you? And what does it look like or feel like?
Well, I guess it means not being triggered by things that you see. So, yeah.
So what would
I'm
that
not sure.
look like?
I'm not sure reclaiming is possible. Releasing, maybe.
Gotcha. Go ahead, Holly.
I think you were out of the room, Candace, when I was commenting that I think reclaiming is reclaiming our feelings as being valid, and restoring is that restoring your sense of your personal integrity, your sense of self as okay, and releasing is the healing part. I saw somebody say recently that dogma by its very nature separates, because it's always defining us as either in or out. And I thought, yeah, that's true. And dogma can be scientific, it can be anything. But I think that once you start through that healing process, eventually you've got to find things to replace what you got out of that former situation. If that was your family, if that was your social life, if that's where you learned anything new, if that's where you came together to have fun and rejoice and celebrate life, all of that's gone now. And so you can't just sit at home and cry in your beer. You've got to do some active work at some point to explore and figure out what is it that's going to bring you those things again.
I do think it's important for us as pagans not to define ourselves in opposition to Christianity. I think we can look at Christianity and our experiences with it, or any monotheism, and say, yeah, okay, I know what that is. I don't want us to be like that. But we need to define ourselves more positive and separate, not as a reaction to, but as an independent and very, very valid and very ancient spiritual tradition.
You bring up a very good point, Candace, that there, in groups that I have been in the past, our discussions were always about what we were coming from and not what we were going to. And that was something that was very important for me to try to focus on, is it's not even necessarily about what I was leaving, but that was a big component for a lot of other people, but it was what I was seeing in front of me and what I wanted to embrace. And I think focusing on more of that positive aspects of it makes it a little bit easier at times to release those feelings.
Yeah. Right.
Go
looking
ahead.
forward, not looking back.
Yeah. Cedar, go ahead.
No, I think that that's important. I think that many people have found ways to integrate faith in lots of different ways. For me, it really was very much going towards something else. I had it was in 2021. I spent some time in Ireland. I had some really deep religious experiences, and religiously, like personally, things fell in place for me. And it was really interesting. For me, there was just this profound shift, and I just found myself unable to go back to church again. Unable to walk back into a church, unable to like go to services. It wasn't, not that they're, not because it was bad or wrong. It just wasn't for me anymore. And it was just this profound shift for me towards something that was for me more life-giving and more affirming. And so for me, it felt like being free, and free to go down this new path. And so yeah, I think that was my experience.
Thank you. Wes, how about you?
I think for me, it's hard to narrow it down in some ways. I could just talk about this for a while. There's so many things coming up, but like Cedar said, it was becoming pagan was more affirming, life affirming, and so because I was such a devout Christian for half my life, I guess. It's a lot about releasing so much. It's releasing, sort of concepts of what is divinity, why are we here on this earth, what does our life mean, how should we spend our time, and then things like, I felt like I had lost my ability to have any kind of intuition or instincts. Everything was like, oh, what does the Bible say? What does the preacher say? What does the church tradition say? I couldn't think for myself. To everything from sexuality and gender and all these things that I had experienced, but I had to say, oh no, those aren't valid because someone else says so. So it's and even though I've been pagan for a while now, it's still this releasing process. And I think sometimes it's I don't want to be the kind of pagan who, is still Christian mentally somehow, and I'm just in pagan clothes, so for example, I might have been a literalist biblically once upon a time, but I don't want to take paganism too literally, because I think that can also be a danger. So that's the kind of things of how it looks for me. And I feel like there's always another layer to pull back yeah.
Fantastic, thank you. So, are there elements of your former religion that you incorporate into your pagan practice, and how does that work for you? Let's see. Holly, your mic is open. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, it does. I can't help it. It's just, like I've said before, it's deeply embedded in me. And I was on a panel a few years ago with a Holocaust survivor, and she turned to me. Some of you've heard this story. She was being dramatic and she was kind of a diva. And she says, Pagan Schmegan, where do you get your ethics from anyway? And I went, oh my God. But, it made me think a lot. And I realized, yeah, I've studied virtue ethics and philosophy, but I really learned the sandbox rules from my grandmother, who was Baptist. Be nice to other people, treat everybody the same, be kind, be loving. And of course, she didn't talk about knock them down sometimes when they treat you like crap, because she wasn't that kind of lady. But yeah, I can't deny those influences. And I will say it was after I completely quit believing that Jesus ever even existed. And I know not everybody feels that way, but after all my research, I think that's the case. I think that's the case. And then suddenly the Bible was beautiful to me again, especially like the Sermon on the Mount, Beatitudes, that stuff. Because it didn't matter anymore whether it was a fact or not. It didn't matter if it was history. I just heard the message. So yeah, there's elements that I remember, and I also recognize them in the type of paganism that I practice now, because my particular tradition is Kemetic, and you know, it was another Mediterranean area ancient religion. There are some commonalities, can't help but be.
Fantastic, thank you. Candace.
Well, I think the part of Christianity that I most identified with was the teachings of Jesus. But what I saw the church doing but had very little to do with the teachings of Jesus. So I felt if I really wanted to live as Jesus did, I would have to leave the church. So I still think, as Holly says, the Beatitudes, the Sermon on the Mount, things like that, have certainly helped to shape me and to some extent my pagan practice.
Thank you. Cedar?
I think the answer is yes, certainly. Certainly, I still feel very drawn to the story and teachings of Jesus in a different way. I think for me, the common thread has always been connection to land and earth. That's always been my deepest connection from very young. And so there are ways that Christianity and the Bible can foster that as well. And I found those ways. And, you know, paganism certainly gives me, it feels like it gives me a lot more insight into that and a lot more resources for that. And that has always been the draw of paganism for me. So yes, those threads continue. And you know, I think of deity really differently and think of relationship to the divine very differently now. So yeah, yes and no, absolutely.
Thank you. Wes?
Well, I think about this in a couple ways. I have, so part of my spiritual practice I have revolves around ancestor veneration. And that's really pretty basic for me. And so most of my more recent ancestors are all officially Christian. Maybe they had some other leanings I don't know about, but as far as I know, they were, you know, Christians. And so, but I think that sort of gets filtered somehow down to less dogma and more about something that's basic to all humans, regardless of what religion you are. And so, for example, my mother's family for centuries has been part of the Moravian Church. And they have a slogan or the motto that says, in essentials, unity, in non-essentials, liberty, and in, excuse me, and in all things, love. And for me, that's a really beautiful motto. And the Moravians always, it's more of a culture than like a theology or a dogma. But in spite of them being, in some cases, a more conservative branch of Christianity, there's also much more acceptance. There's a lot more freedom and grace and flexibility and a way to move around. And so I think that really affected me and still shapes who I am today. So I'm really happy for that. On the other hand, my spiritual practice is centered in Haitian voodoo. And there's a lot of things in voodoo that's very Christian because of the way it was formed with West African traditions, and Christianity was, in most cases, Catholicism was imposed on top of that. So it was syncretic. And in our group, in our house, one thing we talked about a lot was whether to use things like the Lord's Prayer, the Apostles' Creed, and because that's done in voodoo. And I always like absolutely not. No way. I can't do that because in those cases, those were things that were statements of belief, and it might have had a purpose in the 1800s or 1700s in Haiti. But for me, I don't need to hide per se that I practice voodoo like those folks did. I'm not enslaved, thank goodness. So I have a lot completely different context. So to start talking about, I believe in the one true God and all this, I just can't separate myself from that. But on the other hand, a lot of the voodoo spirits are uh, associated with Catholic saints. And although I didn't grow up Catholic, I really find that those associations are incredibly deep and inspiring. And so I really enjoy exploring the lives of these saints. And even if they weren't literally true, that's okay. It's kind of like Holli said about the Bible. There's so much inspiration there, and what the lives of these saints are trying to convey and what they represent to people, and then how that is associated with voodoo spirits is really, really incredible once you sort of dig down beneath the surface. So that's one thing that is Christian that I'm happy to keep.
Thank you. And even things that were not they're totally apparent to us as we are moving through our lives. We can feel it's something that our past religions just come out of us. I'll give you an amusing example. My husband, who was raised Catholic, altar boy, the whole deal, became pagan for a short period of time, moved out to Utah and became Jewish, converted to Judaism. So he's run quite the gamut. And somebody had said to him, "May the force be with you." And accidentally, it was just triggered. He said, "And also with you." So these things that still are ingrained in your psyche that do come out in sometimes an amusing manner. So I have one question, and I know we've got some people that have questions for us, but I have one question more to present to the panel that was not on the list. So forgive me if I'm throwing a new one out to you, but this is the CoG Leadership Institute. As you've gone through and processed, or you continue to process reclaiming, restoring, releasing of your former religion, how would you go about helping others in your encounters as a leader in the pagan community? Holly, your mic is open first, or actually Candace, if you want to jump in, you just turned yours off.
Okay, I'll just jump in there then. I think listening is very, very important, and sharing your experience and helping people to know that they're not alone. They're not the only one that's been through this, that others are going through it also. Holly, what do you think?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I basically said earlier, watch the movie together, get them out of the house, just do what you do, but then encourage people to do those personal inventories and figure out what was it in what ways have I been abused or misinformed, or where are my traumas? But then also to look at what was the good part. And I did want to mention that there's a term I found useful that I ran across: shattered faith syndrome. And that seems to be coming into common use in recent years. And then I also heard, I've forgotten her, I think her name was Pauline Breen, was at Mystic South, one of the keynoters who came over from Ireland and talked. And at one point, and I only got to write down this much of it, but she was talking about her own trauma like this and being around people who still loved the church. And she said, it just came to me from Bridget, How dare I unload my religious trauma on these people who are happy? That's not what I'm here for, which I thought was really good. And then the other thing was, I know that the four of us here all have backgrounds in Christianity, and that is the predominant religion in this country, but their fundamentalism comes up in lots of places. You know, I especially want to recognize the indigenous people who were forced to join a church up until around here, the 80s. So that's why most Native Americans are basically evangelical Christians, and got that hammered into them. So anyway, we just need to remember that just because we had a bad experience, there's other people that have had different, but also difficult experiences. That's it.
I just want
Go ahead.
Oh, you froze again, Candace.
to add that I took a course in psych, very, very helpful to look at the religious experience in a more academic way.
You're still okay. Sorry, I didn't know if you were, but we missed part of you. Thank you, Candace. Cedar.
think supporting other people, I think is the same regardless of what they're going through. My background and training is in chaplaincy, and so just being present with people. And Holli, you were saying that like everyone's experience is going to be different, everyone's trauma is going to be different. And I've spent lots of time working with people who are working through their own past religious traumas, from Christianity or from other religions. I mean, there are pagans with trauma from their experience as well. Nobody's immune. No tradition is immune from harmful and abusive behavior. And so, yeah, I think just being present with people, and supporting them on whatever path they're on is, that's the most important thing. Whatever path they are, what are on, whatever they're coming from or going towards. Like our role, I think the role of religious leaders in general is to just be there with them. The advantage of being pagan is you don't have to proselytize, so don't do it.
Thank you. And Wes.
I'll say one thing that is real important to me anyway is I would encourage folks to, seek out professional therapy if needed. I mean, sometimes some therapists may not really get into spiritual matters. So maybe you might find someone who offers spiritual direction, which is more long-term, because, and especially as the field of research into religious trauma is becoming more and more, it's becoming deeper. There's just more information about how much things can affect us because of a form of religion that we don't even realize. And so I think just for folks to take, if you're struggling with your spirituality, take that seriously. That's very important. And I think sometimes in our culture we go, oh, that's, when I have time, I've got all these other things to do. Well, that's true. But if everyone isn't the same degree spiritually, meaning you may not think it's as important as someone else does, but if it's important to you, then take it seriously, because it's obviously something that you care very much about. And I think if you don't address it, at least for myself, in the past, when I haven't addressed spiritual issues, they didn't go away. I had to address them eventually. So that's why I would say, seek out support from others.
Thank you very much. Yeah, take care of your mental health just like you would your physical health. Make it a priority. All right, we have a few hands up. We'll go through some questions. Sarah Jane.
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much for doing this. This is wonderful. Going back to, what we used in our former religions and moving to whatever religion you are now. For me, I was raised Catholic, and I found the Maranatha movement with the nuns. The nuns sang all the time. And so learning how to sing was a beautiful thing that Catholicism taught me. And then our family moved into the fundamental Christian born again movement. And that also taught me how to move energy and how to harness energy and how to work with energy and how to move it through my body without falling down, right? How to use that in my practice. And as a priestess, as a Wiccan priestess, now I find those two tools that I've used in my past lives, I guess, for lack of a better term, that are very fundamental in my own practice. And so using those in a really personal way, that if I need to move energy, I can do it through song, or if I need to move energy through my body or through a circle or whatever I'm doing, that those practices were key in my own spiritual growth. So I try to hold on to those positive things and kind of release the dogma and let my family, who's still very fundamental Christian, know that those are things that I brought into my own practice and that they are beautiful things and we share them together. So let's sing together, and we're still all able to enjoy our own spiritual practices of energy movement, regardless of what God we're talking to. So I just wanted to share that and was wondering if others had kind of a similar experience.
Thank you for sharing that. Does anyone want to comment? Thank you so much. No, that's really, it's a really, it's moving when you see that there are transferable tools, and that we do things in a much more similar way than we maybe had anticipated. So, Janice.
Janice?
Yes, I'm here. Hi, Mary Meet. Wes, so nice to meet you. Another Budanis. Hey. So very nice to meet you. Well, my issue, and I'm still going through it actually, is my father had died 30 years ago. So I've been a witch for almost 30 years, starting in Salon. And yesterday was my mom's birthday. She would have been 92 if she would have survived. They're having a huge party for her at my brother's house. And guess who wasn't invited? I just give you one guess. Me, because my family is mostly Southern Baptist. And I stopped doing that when I was 12, but I didn't become a witch until I was 29. So 17 years later. And I still struggle with that because that's always going to be around. You know, they're Baptist and I'm the witch. And the Voodooists, you know, I sacrifice animals for my religion, even though that's really not that much difference than going to Popeyes or KFC and getting a bucket of chicken and having it for dinner. But, you know, they don't recognize that as similar statues. So how can I better come to my family, or since it's been 30 years since my father had died, just leave it alone and go on with my business, so to speak. Because last week, or what's today, 17th, almost 2 weeks ago, I was telling Candace that I went to the Sekhmet temple because I was in Vegas with my sorority, and everybody said, you have to go to the Sekhmet temple. And so one of my friends that actually lives in Vegas took me down there, and I had an enormous spiritual uplifting in the temple. I mean, you know, I almost passed out because it was like 112 in the shade, as in 112 in the shade. Then I had that big emotional where I heard Sigmund talking to me, and half of it I didn't understand. And the other half I was crying and laughing and talking to my friend who had her own spiritual revelation there, and she's Christian. You know, she took me to it because I asked her to take me to it, and I didn't rent a car, and I don't like driving in places that I don't know where I'm going. So she took me there, and we both had an experience. And I told my brother about it, and he's like, "Oh, here you go again with that hokey smoky, you know, whatever." And like I said, they're having this party for my mom, who's been dead for 12 years now. And, you know, I'm here at home, partially wanting to be at that party and partially not wanting to be at that party.
Well, Janice, I'll just say that's so tough when families involved. My goodness. But I think you have to do what's best for you. I don't think there's any right answer. You know, if you want to certainly, you know, make overtures to your family and try to get on their good side or whatever to get invitations. I mean, that's something you can do. But I think it's equally as valid to say, I'm just done with that. And you know, practicing voodoo, you don't have to go to their party to celebrate your dad or anyone else. Your ancestors are, I mean, they're always with us. So, you know, so yeah, you can practice that on your own, but sometimes it's more fulfilling when you have other people around, for sure. Yeah, I think you have to figure out what's right for you and where your spirit is leading you. Yeah. And that's just tough. I'm very sorry that that's happening.
Janice, both my parents died without me being able to talk to them about my spirituality, and I tried, and they wouldn't. And we were
My
not.
mom thought I was a Buddhist for the longest time. I don't know why, but
I finally realized it was not about me. This was about them, and I just needed to let it go. And I've often wished I could have had those conversations, but they wouldn't have understood. So it's okay for me.
Well, Janice, I'm just so happy you got out to the Sekhmet temple and that you had an experience. I'm assuming it was a good experience.
Oh, yes, extremely good.
Good, good. That place is full of magic. That's probably the most magical place I've ever been.
I don't have anything profound to add other than I'm really sorry. My mother died the beginning of this year. And my family kind of cut me out of the funeral. And you know, so I mean, for me, it's a combination of religion and being trans, but there's no one right way to deal with family rupture. I think for a very, very long time, I tried really hard to stay on my family's good side and, you know, kind of participate as much as possible. And my choice was eventually to just let it go. You know, I love them. I wish them all the best. You know, my mom's important to me and I can celebrate her however I can, whatever feels right to me. But it's, yeah, there's no pain quite like it. So yeah, just extending, you know, whatever blessings you'd like to receive, and just a lot of love in that process.
Thanks, everybody.
Real quick before we go on to our next question, I lost my mother last month, and one of our faculty members at Cherry Hill reached out to me and said, just keep talking to her. Just, you know, in your head, vocally, however you want, you know, just keep talking to your mom, keep talking to your dad. Because at the end of the day, it's what's healing us. And I took that advice to heart. It was really helpful to me. We got a couple more questions we want to get to. Byron?
Hi, Margo, I'll just follow on that. Ironically enough, throughout my entire childhood and adolescence, etc., my mother would always tell me when her mother had visited her. Mama visited me today, etc., etc. And then it was 1999 when her first grandchild, my niece, was born. And shortly after that, she said to me, Mama, stop visiting me now. And, you know, that presence of her mother with her that whole time. And when I told this story to my brother, who is Christian clergy, I respect him profoundly because he works in the trenches in a community mission in Buffalo, New York. And we're having the two families Zoom New Year's meeting. And I told this story, and my brother was like, Mom never told me any of those kinds of things. And I said, well, okay. But I'm profoundly grateful for all of this. This topic was actually something that I had emailed with Holli back and forth about, because my movement into animism, what I was born with, raised in the church, became Christian clergy, even though in the liberal American Baptist Martin Luther King social gospel tradition, I helped found an interfaith center in the 90s in New Jersey. I've taught world religions for 20 years, lived around the world, was partly Buddhist. In seminary, they called me the Baptopalian in the Budeo-Christian tradition. The thing that I have found, and it's interesting, someone did mention spiritual direction. I'm in Vermont, and from 2010 to 2014, I was the pastor of the local ABC UCC church here, at the same time going through a divorce. And I started working with a Roman Catholic spiritual director who originally was a Qigong practitioner. His master was in Malaysia. And the thing that the person I was reading a lot was Thomas Merton. And the thing that I found was that, you know, Merton wanted to be the bohemian literary star when he was at St. Bonaventure, and then had his conversion experience, became a Cistercian monk, whatever, I can't remember what he was, but in any event. And he said that previous self, me, was a false self, and that coming into the Catholic Church for him was a true self, or an authentic self. And I realized it's quite the opposite for me. That, you know, my religious, my professional Christian self was my false self. And it's completely Wordsworth right now. The child is the father to the man. And the thing that I have found most useful for me, because my mentor is Onondaga, he's Haudenosaunee, lives in Ithaca, New York. And I've known him since the 90s. And so all along the way, I would lecture in his Intro to Native American Studies class at Cornell University about Jackson Pollock and the Native American influence on his artwork, because I'm an art guy too. And he would introduce me as the Reverend Major, then my name, and say, he's the only person I know who's more fucked up than I am. And, you know, he taught me the worldview that I already knew inherently myself growing up as a boy in the woods in New Jersey. What having a mentor who is indigenous helped me understand was that that non-Genesis, non-hierarchical pyramid worldview, that Abrahamic pyramid, which I never accepted in Sunday school. Because I was always the guy who was like, you know, well, we're going to teach you how to stack Bibles. And even if the Bible's the big one, we're going to put it on the top. And I'm like, what are you doing that for? It's only going to fall over because it unbalances the pyramid. But the Abrahamic Genesis pyramid worldview was something that I never looked at the world that way. His mentoring of me now, you know, is just come back full on. And I had a Northern Cheyenne friend, a young woman, when I worked at Dartmouth College in their diversity office. She was my intern. And her generation, she's in her 30s now. It's very much about mental decolonization. This whole thing about, you know, Christianity having been enforced on indigenous Americans, you know, the forced conversions, the forced baptisms, as well as just the kind of, well, if you assimilate and become like us, you'll get more stuff. That whole part of the indigenous history here, which was the other good thing my mentor taught me, was the true history of the United States. That for the younger indigenous generation, this real program, this process of mental decolonization, whether it's from imposed Christianity or the American economic worldview, the socially constructed patriarchal worldview. And so what I found for me in my process right now is that taking that idea of mental decolonization, because I was a philosophy of religion major, so I get mental colonization, okay? Mental decolonization has been a program, if you will, or a way of thinking that has helped me a great deal, such that now I'm more comfortable in my own skin than I ever was as a church boy or as a Christian clergyman. You know, it has been profoundly liberating. So now one of the other practices that I have, that I've taken on, is through art making, and I make animist art now with the found objects from the White River here in Vermont and things like that. So I just wanted to offer that about this. It's something then that I have learned from the indigenous people, because if people ask me now, I just say, well, what's your religion? I say, I'm a guest on Turtle Island. Because that's what I am. You know, I'm not going to be adopted into an indigenous nation, but I understand the spiritual beings and the other life forms around me here, and I now communicate with them. And well, you can see the smile on my face. It's way better than all of the mental gymnastics that I was having to do, even as a good social gospel, philosophically trained, historical, theological, liberal clergy person. You know, the best that I think a lot of Christians can be, except maybe the Catholic sisters who are really rad Earth Mother people. This process is something that I would recommend to anyone who might be struggling in some way. It's like, look to what we can learn from the people who were here first, if we're Euro-American or Euro-Canadian. It's not about playing Indian, not at all. And that would be disrespectful and wrong. It would be coming to understand where we live, to help us as animists, pagans, witches, however we're identifying ourselves. So thanks. This has been great today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Byron, for your comments. Holly, I know you had some final comments before.
I shared them, but I see Maka has a hand up.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Maka.
And you need to unmute yourself, Maka.
I waited so long. I have three things now, but I'll try to be succinct. I do want to make an announcement before we close down, but first I wanted to remind people with all this talk about colonization of indigenous people on this continent, the same thing happened in Europe. Many of our European ancestors were also, Christianity was spread from the top down. It was forced upon the peasantry and the other what we would call pagan or pagan-oriented people. I just want to remind people of that because that's the way Christianity works, where whatever continent it lands on. The other thing is that I know that many of us, whether we're chaplains or not, and I'm not, are called upon to perform both weddings and memorials and other rites of passage. And I keep telling people, and I know that you guys know this, but it bears repeating, it's not the time to be in anybody's face about religion, because in all of those circumstances, there are people of many religions, more than one religion, not many necessarily, maybe only two. I did a wedding, for instance, with people who were Jehovah's Witnesses. It's just you have to carefully craft whatever you're doing around a way that's embracing of all and is not in anybody's face about how your religion is superior, because that's what you get from, quote, the other side, I think. So I just want to remind us of that. It's not that we know that, but they don't necessarily. That's all. And then I have an announcement when you're done. That has nothing to do with this thing. Thank you. This thing today. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm looking to see if there are other hands up. No more hands. Oh, I hear Valerie. I'd like to hear from Deborah.
Deborah wanted to have a.
And we are at the end of our time, so we do
All
need
right.
to be
Well, I meant
brief.
to put my question in a second time a few minutes ago, and I failed to do so. So I will just, and I have a bit of a rant, which isn't a great thing to close with. So I will just say that it appears the first three of the segments were very interesting and valuable to me. But the fourth segment that I'm in, it appears that the way this was set up indicates that in Cherry Hill, being a former Christian is an unmarked category, and therefore you can get 4 former Christians on a panel like this, which I think was a mistake. I have just spent the last more than an hour listening to the concerns, the traumas, and the issues of people who used to be Christian. I'm 75 years old. I've been a Jew all my life. I've been a witch for 50 years, and it's rather a different thing, and nobody here knows enough about it to speak to it. So if you do this again, please bear in mind that not everybody who becomes a polytheist comes from a Christian background, and that Christianity is an outlier in many ways among the world's religions. And so the experiences, the categories, the emotions, the values that people who take up a pagan religion or a polytheist religion have are not necessarily yours, and that we do not have the same relationships with the religions of our upbringing or our ancestry that you have. And you miss out a chance to give a little space to that. Apart from that, you put tremendous work into this, and I think it was well worth my time, and I really appreciate having an opportunity to do it, and I hope to see some of you again. And sorry to be such a downer. I wanted to talk about this earlier, but I didn't have a chance.
Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you, Deborah. Holly, was there anything else that you wanted to say for the good of the order?
Is Morgana still here?
She
Well, okay, then thank you again. Thank you. And I want to especially thank all our volunteer panelists for your time. And everybody who signed up for this, I'm adding you to our Cherry Hill email list. If you don't like that, all you have to do is unsub. Just click whatever it comes through. And that's just the way we do things. And Maka, you have an announcement before we end this?
Yes, of a cultural nature, if you will. I have a dear friend who's long gone, who passed away 10 years ago. And as on September 21st, we are doing a launch of this beautiful pagan music that has not been available for over 30 years. It's called Lunacy, is the name of the group. I'm going to be sending out flyers. I'll send it to the newsletter and stuff, but mark your calendars. It's noon on Pacific time. It's for 2 hours, noon Pacific time on Zoom, free. Just come. You will love it. It's just gorgeous, gorgeous contribution to pagan culture.
Maka, would you say the name of the group again? I couldn't hear that.
Lunacy. Lunacy.
Oh, Lunacy. Thank you.
There's a lot of groups that use that name, unfortunately, so it's confusing. So, but it is called Lunacy. I didn't name it, so.
So if we did a search for Lunacy, what word?
Well, if you go to
Good.
Maka Nightmare, it's not live yet, but it's going to be makanightmare.com/lunacy. But I'll be sending this everywhere, and I want people to send the announcement. We've been designing the flyer as we've been talking today, so because it's a rush. But it's on Harvest Home on the 21st in the daytime, so people can still do the fall equinox in the evening. And I hope you come. You'll love it. You'll be so glad. It's really beautiful stuff. Thank you.
Thanks again, everybody. I think that our time is up. It was great to be with you. And our time's over now.
Thank you, Holly.
Thank you. Take care.
Everyone, take care.
Thank you all, and blessed be.
Blessed be, Scott.
Kisses to you all.
And
Be
to
well.
you.
To you, Deborah.
And thank you, Martha, for letting me get a word in edgewise. Bye-bye.
If everybody will log out, I can close things up.
Yep. See ya.